in mapping out this really exciting public land acquisition, this LWCF identified property in the Jemez Mountains. We're going to be meeting at the Valles Caldera Visitor Center. So at basically the Valles Caldera headquarters. We're going to be meeting there Friday about 10:30. And so what I'm going to do, if anyone wants to text message me or email me, we'll set up a rendezvous point somewhere, probably in Bernalillo or maybe San Isidro or somewhere on the way where we can all meet, and then we'll caravan up so that we can meet up there and hike around and enjoy some really incredible currently private land that we hope to soon have publicly accessible for everybody to enjoy. So again, because of social distancing and things like that, we're going to cap this at about 12 people. So it's the first 12 people that respond to me and let me know that they're interested in participating that'll be able to make that trip. So again, my cell phone and email address is on the screen. And with that said, I'm gonna go ahead and jump in on how this evening's presentation is going to go. First question, can everybody hear me pretty clearly?
Sounds great. Don't forget to press record.
Oh man, thank you very much, because I would have forgotten. I don't know how to, I'm not seeing the recording.
We can hear you.
Okay, I'm looking for the record button and I don't see it on the bottom of my screen.
It should, I don't know.
It says it's recording already.
Recording on my screen, man. I see record with a red dot. Looking good.
Awesome, Dr. Malcolm. Good to hear you all the way from Wisconsin, unfortunately. Thanks for joining us this evening.
Didn't miss it, brother.
So here's the way I'd like to do this. I'm not going to put everybody on mute. I'd like everybody to just mute and unmute themselves as they see fit. I would really like this presentation. I guess I should silence my cell phone. I would really like this presentation to be very interactive. I would imagine that folks have a fair number of questions about this trip, what prompted it, the type of gear I used, costs, no question. Sorry about that, guys. I'm going to turn this cell phone to silent here real quick. No question is inappropriate. I'm happy to talk about any and every aspect of the trip. And okay, so now that the cell phone is silenced, what I'd like to do is have the conversation, talk about the trip, let everybody know how it went and all of the ups and downs and pros and cons of the adventure. And then I've also got a slideshow that I'll be sharing my screen on. So I'll share the screen and we'll go through some visual illustrations of some of the experiences that I'll be talking about in this verbal presentation. So to make it kind of less cumbersome, I probably won't go through the slideshow as I tell the stories. I'll tell the stories first, then we'll look at some pictures, and feel free to answer questions at any time throughout the presentation. Any questions from anybody before we get started? All right, it sounds like we're ready to go. I see that John Pierce is on the call, which is super exciting because this story actually started in 2016 when John Pierce called me and said, "Hey, buddy, I'm going to Alaska for a moose hunt. I really want you to come with me, but I'm going with or without you. So make up your mind and do it quickly." And so in 2016, John and I departed for Fairbanks, Alaska, where we rented a U-Haul truck and went on a multi-week moose hunt on the 40-mile river system. And it was an exceptional experience, but if you read the write-up that Ben Neary prepared, you saw that one of the unfortunate events that occurred on that trip is I actually sprayed myself with bear spray, and that was definitely not an enjoyable experience. And that trip was very, very challenging. It was a tough trip. It was cold. We were dealing with a lot of incredible conditions, and I was blown away by the pure grit and strength and tenacity that was displayed by John Pierce throughout that trip. And it caused me to start asking myself the question, could I have done that trip if I was solo? Could I have done that if I didn't have the support of another incredible outdoors person with me? And I wasn't sure that I could, to be quite honest. I thought that it might have been too much for one person to handle, but the question continued to nag at me, and the challenge continued to kind of pull on me a little bit until I made the decision that I was going to do the same trip. So initially, my goal was to do the exact same route that John and I did. But the way Alaska works, it's a little interesting because you have to get into these areas with a bush flight. And bush pilots kind of have territories in which they work. And so I wasn't able to get a bush flight into that same exact area. So the remote landing strip where I ended up flying into for this particular caribou hunt was probably about maybe 200 miles. John, would you say it was about 200 miles from where we originally started our trip? So I was probably 200 miles away, but in the same general area, dealing with the same type of conditions that we had dealt with on our moose hunt. Because moose are such huge animals, I mean, we're talking about a 2,000-pound animal, and knowing I was going to be doing this trip solo, I made the decision to actually pursue caribou instead of moose, because I felt like a moose was just going to be a little bit too much for me. And so I made the decision to pursue caribou on this trip. And I will tell you that a caribou hunt is very different than any of the hunting experiences that we would have in the lower 48. The hunt itself is not as much of an adventure as the overall trip. And so if you can time the migration right, and if you can get yourself in a place where the caribou are coming through, then finding caribou is not a hard part of the adventure. The hard part of the adventure is getting to that place and then surviving the trip out of that place. So with, is the background noise too loud for you guys? Can you hear that?
Yeah.
Ben, can you hear the background noise there? Okay,
Yeah, it's a bit loud.
I'm going to move into a conference room. This will just take a second, but I'm at a coffee shop because we had a big storm last night and my internet is not working very strong. So I'm just going to move into a conference room so it'll be a little bit quieter. All right, this is going to be a little quieter for everybody. Sorry for the interruption. Okay, you guys hear me all right?
Yep.
All right, sorry about that, guys. So anyway, like I was saying, the caribou hunt itself, the actual pursuit of the animals, is obviously just one small component of the overall trip. So I'm basically gonna start with the planning on how this thing came together. And so my first goal was to find a bush pilot that would be willing to drop me off in a super remote wilderness location in Alaska. And interestingly, that turned into be kind of a challenge because the first pilot I called was booked up for a number of years. The next two pilots that I contacted were not willing to drop someone off to do this type of a trip as a solo adventure. They kind of viewed it as perhaps some type of a liability. And when I explained the trip that I was planning and what I was wanting to do, I had two different pilots that just declined and said that they were not going to participate in that type of an adventure because they didn't think it was responsible. And so then I got a hold of a guy by the name of Zach Nabel. And Zach Nabel is the owner of a company called Toke Air Service. And so I explained to Zach what he wants to do, what I wanted to do. And he said, look, I don't mind taking you alone. I've got some paperwork I'd like you to sign before I drop you off. Just, acknowledging the situation that you're putting yourself in. But if that's what you want to do, I'm not here to stop you. And the other challenge from a financial standpoint is that Zach's plane was a Cessna 185. And so it actually has the capacity to transport two people. And he said, look, this is what it cost me to fly the plane. So if you're one person or two people, the price is the same. And so from a cost standpoint, that's the most significant expenditure, at least on this trip, and for probably most Alaskan bush type trips. I would say the most extensive expenditure you're going to encounter is the bush flight. So anyway, with the agreements made and the arrangements made, everything was set to go. Now, this arrangement was made almost 2 years ago. So it was 2018 at some point in the year, I don't remember exactly what month, that I made the plans to do this trip in August of 2020. Now, as 2020 started, I was really excited. I was super stoked about the trip, and everything was going great. And then we got nailed with this coronavirus. And so early 2020, probably March, April, I saw my goal of doing this Alaska trip kind of fade away. And I'd come to the conclusion that chances are this is not going to happen. I didn't think traveling across the country was going to be possible. I didn't think travel was going to be allowed. There was a period of time where the state of Alaska was not allowing people from out of state to enter the state. I didn't think airlines were going to be flying. And quite frankly, I didn't know if it was even responsible for me as a person to travel around the country and then come back to my family with the potential of bringing back some, this unknown virus that has been on everybody's mind. So this kind of created some challenges because I essentially stopped planning. I kind of gave up on the idea and didn't really prepare as I would have done had I known the trip was going to happen, but I kind of lost interest, if you will. And then it was actually like the end of July. It was towards the end of July when I made the decision that this was possible. Alaska passed a rule that you could enter the state providing you had a COVID test that was negative and had been taken within 72 hours of your arrival in Alaska. So if I could get a doctor, or clinic or someone to give me the COVID test, I could get the results inside of 72 hours and be at the airport in Fairbanks inside of 72 hours from the moment the test was taken, then the state of Alaska was going to allow me to exit the airport. And boy, I'll tell you, they took this very, very serious. There were people that showed up at the airport when I did on August 11th in Fairbanks that did not have their test results, and they had security officers in place with desks, check stations where they're checking all of your paperwork. There were people that showed up with paperwork that was 80 hours. It'd been 80 hours since they took the test. Those people could not pass the line in the airport. I mean, they would not let them out of the airport terminal. People were freaking out. People were screaming. I mean, it was chaos because they're saying, what am I supposed to do? I mean, I'm stuck at the airport. And they said, yep, you find a flight somewhere but here. You're not coming in Alaska. So anyway, it was challenging, but I was able to get the test. I had a negative test result. I went and met with my doctor who helped me to prepare a strategy to ensure that I was safe while traveling to Fairbanks. I had one stop in Seattle, and there was definitely concern that if I were to contract the coronavirus en route to Alaska, I was going to be in the bush for almost 3 weeks. And so by the time the symptoms would be presenting themselves, if I was, not asymptomatic, assuming that I did have symptoms of the virus, chances are that those symptoms would have presented themselves at a very, very bad time when I was in a super remote area. And so that was something I was concerned about and wanted to ensure that I could avoid. So my doctor helped me with all of the personal protective equipment that I needed and how to properly wear the equipment and how to protect myself from any possibility of infection. I'll also tell you that the Alaska Airlines was phenomenal. The way they handled everything, the way that they arranged the seating on the airplane, the social distancing, the mask wearing, all that kind of stuff by the airline was really exceptional. And so I felt very protected. I felt like I was in good hands on the trip there. There's no food or drink was allowed on the airplane because they didn't want you to even remove the mask for a moment, really. And I was wearing, of course, N95 masks, the typical masks we see people wearing at the grocery store. My understanding is those are to protect other people. The mask that I was wearing that was provided to me by my doctor was to protect me from, this particular virus. So one of the challenges, because I'd stopped the preparation, is when I got to Fairbanks, I actually didn't really have a ride to Circle. The plan I made with Zach Nabel was that I was going to be at Circle on August the 13th at 7:30 in the morning. And Zach Nabel was going to pick me up at the gravel airstrip in Circle, Alaska at 7:30. He said, be there because it's when I show up, you better be there waiting. If you're not there waiting, I move along and tough luck. So make sure you're at the airstrip in Circle 7:30 a.m. So I arrive in Fairbanks, and I couldn't rent a car, couldn't rent a truck, because again, I'm going to be out there for multiple weeks. And so there were no vehicles available for that length of time. And I'll tell you, I really got lucky by contacting a guy by the name of Steve Frith. And I met Steve a number of years ago in Washington, D.C. I met Steve, and we were working on full and permanent funding for the Land and Water Conservation Fund. We were both working on behalf of backcountry hunters and anglers at the time. We were just both volunteers, and we had done this big fly-in event, and we were staying together at an Airbnb. And Steve Frith at the time lived in Alaska. So I found Steve, contacted him and said, hey man, you still in Alaska? And he said, no, actually I moved, I'm in the lower 48. I got married, I've got kids, you know, a lot has changed since then. He said, you know, what's going on? And I told him about the trip. And as it turned out, Steve had floated the same river and actually made a video about it. You can find it online. It's called The Heart of Hunting. And it's a Caribou float trip that Steve had done. And so it was really awesome because he was able to give me some tips and some pointers and warn me about some, you know, areas that I needed to be very careful about and things like that. But the other thing Steve did is he went a step further and said, you know, I still have some friends in the Fairbanks area. Let me make some calls and see if I can find somebody who would give you a ride to Circle, Alaska. And it's like, man, that would be awesome because I've got to get there tomorrow and I've got over 100 pounds of gear. So like even hitchhiking was a challenging thing because I can't, you know, very easily carry all of my gear and everything I've got to even hitchhike to Circle. Circle is the very last town on the end of the Steese Highway. So from Fairbanks, you leave on the Steese Highway, and where the highway ends is the village of Circle. It's a native village. There's about 66 people who live in the village. It's very off the beaten path. Again, you know, 3.5 hours from Fairbanks. I get a text message from a guy by the name of Steve Shannon. And Steve Shannon says, hey, look, I talked to Steve, says you need a lift to Fairbanks. Something about you're getting dropped off in the middle of the wilderness for a couple of weeks all by yourself. Don't know if that's a good idea, but I do have a pickup truck and I am available to take you to Circle if you still need a lift. So Steve, so that I got to Fairbanks August 11th. August 12th, I had to go to Sportsman's Warehouse to pick up a couple of things, including primarily bear spray. I wanted to get some bear spray and very, very careful with that stuff. And I also wanted to get, I needed to go to Game and Fish to get my hunting license. So my hunting license for caribou plus the fishing license for the entire time I'm there and a general game hunting license is about $960. So I went to the Game and Fish department to ensure I had all my paperwork in order. I had all the right licenses and permits and fees and so on and so forth. So I went to Game and Fish, got that squared away, went to Sportsman's Warehouse, bought my bear spray, and I also bought white gas at Sportsman's Warehouse because most pilots will not allow you to fly with your butane canisters like you might use for a jet boil or something. So instead I was using a stove called an MSR Dragonfly that runs off of white gas. And you can some pilots, bush pilots, don't even want you to bring the white gas, but they'll actually siphon some of the airplane fuel out of the airplane when they land, and you can fill your fuel bottles for your stoves with the airplane fuel. So anyway, I picked up the stuff that I needed at Sportsman's Warehouse in Fairbanks, and then Steve came by and picked me up. I'd never met the guy before, but super great guy. We threw all my stuff in the bed of his truck and started towards Circle. And I can tell you that the weather was horrible. And I've got a lot of videos. I'm actually going to produce a film using a lot of the videos that I took. I'm going to go through the still photo slideshow like I mentioned earlier in the presentation. As soon as I get through the story, I'll have plenty of pictures to share with you so we can look through those and talk about them. I found that the video quality on this Zoom platform, the video and audio quality is not that great. So rather than share the videos, I'm going to actually produce it into one film, and then I'll be able to distribute that to everybody that's on this call so that you can have that video and it'll be a professional, high quality production instead of you know, some grainy looking thing with poor audio on your computer screen. But the weather was unbelievable. Hail, the winds, it's like a hurricane. And I'm thinking, man, this is really bad news. You know, this is heavy duty weather. Anyway, we drive for hours, exceptional conversation, you know, learning all about Steve and his family and his work with various conservation organizations. And as we get to Circle, so again, it's about 3.5 hours later. It's probably 9-10 o'clock at night by this point, by the time that we're getting to Circle. Of course, this is a place I've never been. It's a place Steve Shannon's never been. He said, I've never been there. I don't, you know, it's a tiny little place. We ought to be able to find the airstrip, but you have no, you know, GPS doesn't work. I mean, not GPS, but like Google Maps doesn't work. You don't have those kind of tools. I did have an inReach by Garmin, which was very helpful. The pilot that I mentioned, Zach Nabel from Tok Air Service, made it mandatory that I had an inReach device on the trip. He said, when I pick you up, I'm going to check that you've got a working inReach with a subscription before I fly you out to the bush and drop you off. He's like, at the very least, that's something that you need to have in case you have to push that SOS button. At least you have some form of communication. So I did have the inReach device. But as we get to Circle, and again, it's probably 9 o'clock, I would guess, there's this big sign, and I'll show you a picture of it. Well, matter of fact, maybe this one I'll just pull up right here, just so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. Let me do a screen share here, and can you guys see that sign? So as we pull into Circle, this is what I see. This is the sign coming into the town, and Steve looks at it and says, hey, what do you think, man? I mean, you really want me to drop you off here? It doesn't seem like you're very welcome. And I'll just tell you, the town of Circle is fairly rough looking. It's very lawless. It's a very rural community. There's no law enforcement around. It's typical rural Alaska. And so I told, and with a town of 60 people that's at the very end of the highway, it's very difficult to be secretive about like showing up. I mean, a truck from out of town shows up, people take notice. So I asked Steve, I said, just, you know, drive me to the airstrip, drop me off. I'm just going to kind of slink down into the bushes, set up my tent, lay super low. I'm not going to, you know, I'm going to do my best to ensure that nobody knows I'm here. I don't want people, you know, I don't want any trouble basically, but I have committed to the pilot. And had already paid the pilot a 50% deposit. Going back to the financial part, I mentioned the Caribou tag's $960. Because of coronavirus, I was able to get a round trip flight from Albuquerque to Fairbanks, Alaska for $303. So I was round trip from Albuquerque to Fairbanks for $303. The bush flight from Circle to where I was going to be dropped off in the Yukon Charlie Rivers National Preserve, it's about a 1-hour flight, and it is a one-way flight because I'm getting dropped off and the pilot's moving along and I'm staying behind. That flight is $3,500. So it's a significant financial expense. And I paid the pilot $1,750 as a deposit back in 2018. And so I still owed him $1,750, but the agreement we had, and he was very clear about it, is be at that airstrip at 7:30 on August 13th, and I'll pick you up. And so I didn't feel like I had an option except to disobey the sign as you enter Circle, get dropped off at the airstrip, and hide in the bushes until the following morning. That night, I had 4 different black bears come and join me at camp. At the airstrip in Circle, which was pretty eventful. They were very curious, but they were not aggressive at all. The berry crops are just phenomenal. I mean, these bears aren't hungry. They have plenty to eat. They just wanted to see who's the weird guy hiding in the bushes. The first black bear that came through, I was pretty concerned because I thought it was a person. And I thought, oh man, someone's sneaking around over here spying on me, and they want to know why I'm in their town when the sign clearly says I'm not allowed to enter. Turned out it was just a bear, so I felt really good about that. So that night I had 4 black bears come through. I woke up at 6 o'clock the following morning so that the other thing I'll mention is the mosquitoes were absolutely, I've never seen anything like it. It was the most miserable thing you could have ever imagined when you have literally millions of mosquitoes and I don't like covering myself in DEET, but I had taken 2 bottles of 100% DEET with me on this trip, and I thought I was going to go through both bottles at the airstrip. I mean, I had a head net, I had all of, I was prepared, but these mosquitoes were just so thick, like it would reduce visibility. If you can imagine reduced visibility as a result of swarms of mosquitoes, that's what it was like. But the next morning I woke up at 6 o'clock so I could have my camp all loaded and everything ready to go when the pilot showed up. And about 9 o'clock in the morning, so he said he'll be there at 7:30. Weather was beautiful. It looked gorgeous. By 9 o'clock, I'm kind of freaking out, and some trucks had come to the airstrip from Circle. Trucks had pulled in the airstrip, and I was kind of like hiding in the bushes, not wanting to be seen. And they drove around the airstrip and then left. I don't know what their purpose was, but in any case, about 9 o'clock, I get an in-reach message from Zach Nabel, the pilot, apologizing for the delay, stating that he was in Tok and there had been problems with weather in Tok, and so he was going to be delayed, but he expected he would be there about 11 o'clock. He said he was getting ready to leave. The weather had somewhat cleared up, and that he should be at the landing strip about 11. So I was somewhat disappointed because I was really excited. I'm so eager. I'm just chomping at the bit to get out there. But in Alaska, when you're standing on an airstrip in Alaska, and it's important to remember that you're a lot better off standing on the ground wishing you were in the air than being in the air and wishing you were on the ground. So when a bush pilot doesn't want to fly because of weather, I mean, you really want to be respectful of that decision. Another saying that's pretty common in Alaska is there's old bush pilots and there's bold bush pilots, but there's no old, bold bush pilots. So I patiently awaited till probably 11:30, and then I could hear the plane in the distance. And I was really nervous about Zach landing the plane because everybody in Circle is going to see that this plane is landing, and I was afraid that the townspeople would rush out and want to see what's going on, and my cover would be blown, and they would know that I've been hanging out in their bushes since the previous evening. But nobody showed up. Zach and I loaded his plane as quickly as possible. He had a special container, JP, that the bear spray goes in. In previous flight that JP and I were on together, we had the bear spray in the cab of the bush plane, which is a really bad idea. We didn't know it at the time, but if that bear spray should detonate while you're in a bush plane, everybody on board is dead, essentially. I mean, I don't know how someone could survive that. So Zach actually had this really awesome container specifically made to put the bear spray in, and that way, it couldn't accidentally detonate inside the cab of the airplane. And we jumped in the plane and took off and started flying, and we flew over the Yukon-Charlie Rivers National Preserve. Zach was a phenomenal pilot and very interested in helping me in every way possible. So he flew the river that I was going to be floating so that we could fly over the waterway so that I could look down and see the conditions. Now, Zach was very, he was concerned, and he wasn't trying to scare me, but he was scaring me by claiming that the river was higher than he'd ever seen it. He says, we've been getting rain for 2 weeks straight. This river is almost unrecognizable. Normally this time of year, it doesn't look anything like this, but here we are, so good luck. And we flew over one particular section of river called the Rock Garden. And when I looked out of the airplane at this particular section, it was all I could do to not tell him to just turn around, that I don't think I want to do that anymore. There's a section of the Charlie River, approximately 8 miles long, that can, depending on water levels, be very, very dangerous. Class 3 and 4 rapids, one after the other, and so on and so forth. But anyway, we flew to a very remote landing strip at the far southern tip of the Yukon-Charlie Rivers National Preserve, and he landed the plane, nice bumpy tundra landing, kind of like what you'd expect from a bush plane with giant balloon tundra tires on it, and threw all my stuff out of the airplane in quick fashion. Bush pilots in Alaska seem to always be in a hurry, so we loaded all the stuff out of the airplane as quickly as we could, He jumped back in the plane, said, do me a favor. Hopefully you get back. And if you do, will you please let me know when you've made it back to civilization? I would feel better knowing that you've made it. So if you would send me an in-reach message or send something to my cell phone after you get back, I would really appreciate that. So, you know, we, being coronavirus aware, we gave each other a little elbow touch, and he wished me luck, and the plane flew off. And one thing that that I'll never forget, and I experienced this when I was with JP, but it kind of was almost an even more intense feeling, is when when the sound of the airplane disappears in the distance. It's a very interesting feeling. When you're in a very, very remote area like that, and that plane leaves, there's no roads, there's no civilization of any kind, there's no other people, there's nothing out there. It's just you, the stuff you brought, and you start second guessing everything. You're like, gosh, I hope I brought enough food. I hope I brought this. I hope I brought that. I hope I remembered to get bullets for my gun. All of these things run through your mind. But the plane flew off. I stood there for about probably 10 minutes just looking around and wondering, wow, you know, is this real? It almost is a very surreal experience. And you've been transported into this very unfamiliar landscape. The plants aren't familiar. They're not like anything you're used to seeing. It's like you're on a different planet almost. But by this time now, it's already after 1 o'clock. And I had a goal of where I wanted to get to by the end of the first day. So I rearranged my gear, got my raft inflated. I was utilizing a alpaca raft forager. I've got, you know, pictures and information about that particular vessel that we'll go through here shortly. But I inflated my raft, loaded up all of my gear, and proceeded to drag my raft across the tundra to a small waterway, just a little stream, really. It's probably 3 feet across and not something I could float down. But my feeling was if I can get the raft into that waterway, then I could drag the boat to where that waterway ultimately intersects with a larger stream and is about a 1 mile, roughly a mile from where I got dropped off to where I could get to a stream that I thought would be floatable. That 1 mile, a mile in Alaska, depending on the terrain, can be a very, very long way. It's not like walking across a New Mexico landscape that's, you know, barely traversable. A mile in Alaska, you could be dealing with tussocks, muskeg, swamps, marshes, willows, thorn bushes, devil's club. I mean, all kinds of stuff. And so that mile was pretty exhausting. Probably took me an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours to get to where this small creek intersected a larger stream. And by the time I got there, I thought, man, this is horrible. This is a real disaster already. And of course, I'm afraid the whole time of ripping my raft. If I was to puncture my raft or put a gash in the raft or something, then that would be a huge setback. I did take a repair kit, but I'd seen those rapids flying over with Zach. I was afraid to run the rapids as it was, let alone with a patched up raft wrapped in duct tape and Gorilla Tape and Aqua Seal glue and the stuff that I had in my patch kit. So anyway, when I got to the other waterway, the larger creek, I was exhausted. I was soaking wet. I was covered in sweat and scratched up and everything else from fighting through the willows and the bushes and all the stuff. And I really wanted to get floating. I was like, man, I'm tired of pulling this thing. I'm tired of dragging this thing. This is a raft. It's supposed to be floated. I'm really excited to get on the water. So I re-secured all my gear, made sure that the load seemed to be somewhat balanced. And then I jumped on top of the raft and kicked off into this larger river and started floating downstream. I made it about, I'd say I probably made it half a mile. And then I hit some rapids that I should have gotten out and I should have checked. I should have been scouting the river, seeing what I'm doing. But instead, I'm just in a rush to try to get to where I had in my mind that I was going to be camping that night. You know, I had a waypoint kind of figured out on my Onyx maps of that's where I'm going to camp night number 1. As my raft comes over this incredible rapid, it just completely flips me. I mean, it flips the raft over. launches me out of the raft. I'm not wearing a dry suit. I'm not wearing my PFD because it's all packed up, and I was in a hurry and too lazy to stop and actually get properly dressed and put on my flotation device and all of that. So this crash was, luckily I didn't get injured because it could have been real bad. But I got thrown out of the boat. The boat's upside down. I had tied a rope around the perimeter of my boat through all of the D-rings on the raft. That way, when I was dragging it through that waterway, that's the rope that I was using to drag the vessel. Well, I got thrown out of the raft, and so I was able to grab onto that rope with my right hand, and with my left hand, I was able to grab onto some overhanging willows that were hanging off of the bank. And so now I'm kind of being stretched like if you could imagine one of those torture devices, like where you would be stretched in half, with your right arm going right and your left arm going left. That's the situation I was in. Of course, the water's freezing cold besides, but I've got my left arm holding onto these willows. My right arm is holding onto the raft. The water is moving incredibly fast, and it's tugging at the boat to try to rip it free from my hand. And I'm contemplating what my next move is here, because on one hand, if I let go of the willows, I stay with the raft, which contains all my gear, I hope. The boat's upside down at this point, so I can't see if my gear's tied properly or if stuff's falling out into the river and disappearing, never to be seen again. And this is obviously, every piece of equipment you take on a trip like this is pretty critical. If you don't need it, you don't take it, because you're very cognizant of weight. So I'm contemplating letting go of the willows and just staying with the raft so that I've got my gear. But then I actually was able to fight the current of the water, and using my right hand, I pulled the boat upstream and was able to loop that rope around a rock, a big boulder that was protruding out of the side of the bank of the waterway. So with the rope wrapped around that rock, the boat was now fairly secure, so I was able to use both hands to scramble myself up onto the bank and out of the frigid cold water. And then I was able to pull the boat out of the water. And I mean, much to my amazement and satisfaction, obviously, much to my surprise, all of my gear was still tied onto the raft. I'd used some cam buckle straps and some paracord and things like that to secure all my gear. But quite frankly, I didn't take enough time doing that. And, I was just really lucky that it was a good enough job that everything stayed on the raft. And so I had all my gear. But now I was in a situation where I'm camping there because I have to get out of my soaking wet clothes. I'm shivering by this point. I need to get a fire made. I need to get warmed up. I need to boil some water, regroup. I mean, I was very shaken up. I was kind of a nervous wreck at that point, and here I am about 500 yards into a 200-mile float, and I've already had a pretty horrific accident with this watercraft. So anyway, I camped there for the night, and the next morning I was actually really kind of scared I was very scared to get back on the water, because that shook me up pretty good. That whole situation shook me up and had me scared, and I'm sitting there just in camp wondering, what am I doing? I mean, I see Scott Carpenter's in the meeting here, and Scott is with Adobe Whitewater Club, and I was super fortunate that Scott and other members of the Adobe Whitewater Club actually took me on a rafting trip down the Pecos River earlier this summer, which was the very first time I ever floated this alpaca raft forager. We did a 17-mile float down the Pecos River, and that was the maiden voyage of this particular pack raft. And now that I'm in Alaska, is only the second time I've ever even used the raft, so certainly was fairly new to me. But a lot of the lessons that I was taught by Scott and the other members of that team, there were 6 people on that particular trip, they really came in handy. I think the only thing I should have done that Scott probably told me to do is always be wearing your PFD. And of course, I disobeyed that rule and had a terrible accident, but I can assure you that I never got on the water without it on after that point. So that evening, that morning, I got up, I packed up my stuff, and then I did something I wasn't going to do. The alpaca raft forager has a zipper, a cargo zipper on the back of the raft where you can actually unzip the tubes of the raft and load equipment inside of the tubes of the raft. So you're not loading things on top of the raft, you're actually putting things inside of the raft. And I had talked to Thor Tingley, who's the owner of Alpaca Raft, on a few different occasions, basically questioning the reliability of that. I mean, something about an airtight zipper just really didn't sit right with me. I mean, I'm not familiar with an airtight zipper. He assured me that this thing was not going to be a problem. It was a great design. I was nervous about it. So, but I decided after that first accident, I really needed to lower my center of gravity. These rapids were way intense. And, you know, by loading all my stuff on top of the raft, I felt like I was a little top heavy, and I would be able to gain more stability if I loaded stuff inside the tubes. The only disadvantage of that is that you then have to inflate the raft every day, because at the end of the day, when you get your gear, obviously you have to open up that zipper. When you open the zipper, you lose all the air into the raft, so then you're re-inflating the raft the following day. So that's a little bit tedious, but if it could make for a safer trip down the river, I felt like that was a trade worth making. Although I was still very scared about continually using the zipper, opening and closing it and opening and closing it. I just felt like I was going to end up in a situation where that zipper failed on me. I think everybody's had a tent or a jacket or some piece of equipment where a zipper failure has occurred, and I definitely didn't want that to occur on my raft. But anyway, I opened up the raft, I started using the tubes, and it was fantastic. It was made a huge difference. So I was really glad to do that. And so I continued down the river, camping along the way and stopping periodically to get out and glass for caribou. And I was seeing a lot of caribou up on the ridges above timberline. You know, I had my spotting scope, and I'll share some pictures of these things, but I had my spotting scope and I'm looking at caribou a mile or 2 miles away up on the ridge tops. But I had pretty well decided at this point that there is no way I'm attempting to even shoot a caribou until I get through that rock garden. That rock garden was something that I couldn't get the image out of my mind. After having flown over that section of the river with the pilot, I just knew that I needed to do everything I possibly could to get through that section of river safely, and adding, you know, between 150 to 200 pounds of meat to my raft was a bad idea until after I got through that section. The other concern is I was going to be out there for over 2 weeks, and obviously meat care is priority number one. You know, when a hunter, I think everybody agrees on this, but when a hunter makes a decision to take the life of an animal, you know, we really pride ourselves in doing everything we possibly can to utilize that entire animal and to make the best possible use of it. And that means really taking care of that meat so that you're providing wonderful and delicious and healthy protein for your family and your friends and the people you share the meat with. And so I didn't want to prematurely shoot a caribou, and then I'm going to be stuck with trying to keep that meat cool for such an extended period of time. So that's kind of the way the tributary of the Charlie River went. The following day, though, I got thrown out of the raft. This time the raft did not flip over, which was much better. This time I was wearing a PFD, and this time I was also wearing a dry suit. So it was a much better situation, but the river regularly is going over these giant boulders, and most of the time the raft just floats right over the top of the boulders because there's 6-8 inches of water above the boulder that's flowing over the rocks. But in one particular section of water, and what I was doing is I was pulling over around blind corners and things like that, and walking along the banks of the river and trying to pick my route and choose my course. I called it finding a line. I think that might be the term that they use in the whitewater world. But I'd get out of the raft, tie it up super securely, because if your raft disappears with all your gear on it, you're in a real bad situation. So periodically, when I felt the need to, I would get out and try to scout the route I would be taking. And I had actually scouted this particular route, and it looked like I was going to be able to pass over all of these boulders. But as I was going down the river, the raft hit a boulder that it didn't have enough water to float over. So it essentially came to a screeching stop, and I went right over the side of the raft, kind of over the front. It was at an angle. I hit this obstacle at an angle. You always try to hit it, straight, so straight on that you're not sideways, but it just so happened that with the way the currents were working and maybe my lack of skill in paddling, I'd hit it at a slight angle and the raft came to a stop and I flew over the side. The raft then spinned and continued to float downstream, but again, I was able to grab that rope, and this was much less scary of a situation, because then the water was only about waist deep or so, and so then I just pulled the raft over to the side, pulled it out of the water, collected myself a little bit because I was kind of shaken up by it, but I was dry because I had a dry suit on. So I took a few minutes and made a Powerade drink, a hydration drink thing in my water bottle, and took a break for 15 minutes and then got back on the water, and I was good to go. So I had some incredible camps along the way and saw some beautiful country, and everything was wonderful. And I made it to the Charlie River. So these two accidents happened on a tributary of the Charlie River, but I eventually made it to the Charlie River. And then that's a big waterway, and there was some super awesome rapids on that thing that were very adrenaline pumping, if you will. And sometimes they go for miles. It's just more adrenaline than I cared to have. But eventually the Charlie River leads to Gelvin's Cabin. This is a public use cabin. In Alaska, it's not uncommon that there's old trappers' cabins, and maybe they were built in the 20s or the 30s or the 40s. And they're no longer being used by trappers generally, but those cabins, and they tend to be, most of the time, they're pretty rough. But most of the time they also have a wood stove. And when it's raining and you're soaking wet and you haven't had any modern comforts or conveniences, it can be super luxurious to be able to take all of your wet clothes and your wet gear and hang them up in a cabin and make a fire in the wood stove and dry things out. So I was really eager and anxious to get to Gelvin's Cabin. I'd read about this place and I'd heard about it and I'd flown over it. And I'd made notes as Zach Nabel, the pilot, flew me over the river, that Gelvin's Cabin was just about a mile or so upriver from where that rock garden started, where the worst of the rapids would begin. So Gelvin's Cabin was really important to me for a couple of reasons. One, I wanted to be able to dry out my gear. Two, I knew it as a landmark that was getting ready to start the most intense portion of the trip, which would have been approximately the 10 miles or the 8.5 miles downstream from Gelvin's Cabin, where the water's really intense. And I was really fortunate also because I had this inReach device, and so I was able to text message, and I had text messaged John Pierce to try to get a little confidence and to try to get a pep talk. Here I told you I was going to do this trip entirely solo, but now I need a little encouragement here because I'm afraid of this rock garden. And so John Pierce is looking at satellite images and kind of coaching me a little bit remotely over the inReach conversation about, how I can overcome this and how I can accomplish it, and just giving me a kind of a pep talk, which I was super appreciative of that because it really, really helped. During World War II, a bomber airplane crashed about 3 miles from Gelvin's Cabin, and there were 5 military people on board, and 1 survived out of the 5, and this was in the dead of winter. And this guy survived 81 days in the dead of winter, unbelievable conditions. And there's a book about it. It's called 81 Days Below Zero, and it's a harrowing tale of this lone survivor of this airplane crash. He went back October of the following year, and they recovered the remains of the soldiers who perished in that particular plane crash, but all of the airplane remains untouched. I mean, it's in a super remote area. No one's going in there to get it out. So this bomber, I think it's a B-52, I don't know for sure, but this bomber wreckage exists out on this tundra about 3 miles from Gelvin's Cabin. So again, 3 miles in Alaska can be a really, really long way. But I'd made the decision that what I was going to do is when I got to Gelvin's Cabin, I was going to make a fire. I was going to dry out my gear. I was going to eat a good meal. I was going to get a good night's sleep. And the next morning, I'm going to wake up and I'm going to hike to that wreckage, and I'm going to explore it, and I'm going to check it out, and I'm just going to experience that very few people have gone to it because it's very difficult to get to. And I wanted to do that, and then I would come back to the cabin and stay there a second night. And then by the third day, I was hoping that my muscles would be, I guess, repaired enough and my confidence might be restored enough that I would be mentally ready to attack the rock garden, this incredible series of rapids. So that was my plan. I didn't mention, when I had that very first boating accident, my fishing rod got destroyed. That's really the biggest casualty of that accident, was the destruction of my fishing rod, which was kind of unfortunate because the grayling fishing in the Charlie River is known to be phenomenal. I mean, you should have excellent grayling fishing, but I could have used monofilament line and made a fishing pole out of a willow pole, or, you know, there's a number of things I could have done, but quite frankly, I didn't have the energy to do very much at all. I mean, these are really, really long days. It doesn't get dark until about midnight at this time of year, and you're going nonstop all day long. And at the end of the day, making a fishing rod out of a willow branch, like, I didn't have the energy to do it, and I didn't have the motivation to do it. It was all I could do to get my sleeping pad inflated so I could lay down and pass out. But I was going to rest and recover at Gelvin's cabin, then attack the rock garden. So I got there, I made the fire, I dried out my gear, everything was great. The next morning I woke up super early, decided that I was going to split a bunch of firewood and stack firewood at the cabin and get it all prepared for my return, because the weather was kind of rough and rain was anticipated. I thought by the time I made it back from this 6-mile round trip hike across this Alaskan landscape that I was going to want to just be able to make a fire and relax. And so I was outside splitting wood, actually, and a bush plane landed, you know, on a gravel bar essentially in front of Gelvin's cabin. A little Super Cub well, I don't know if it was a Super Cub, I don't know, but a small, I can't recall what the type of aircraft, but it probably wasn't a Super Cub because it took out more weight than a Super Cub would have been able to carry. But anyway, this bush plane landed in front of the cabin, which was really surprising to me. I mean, I heard it in the distance, but you hear a lot of airplanes in the distance, bush planes, when you're in Alaska. But as it got closer and closer, I thought, man, this guy's going to come in here and land. And of course, he had to circle around a couple times before he came in for the landing. But he did land. I went and talked with him, and I was, you know, surprised to see another human being. I didn't expect that at all. So I was kind of, by this time I've been in the wilderness, I don't know, 8 or 10 days, I think. And hadn't seen anybody. And so it was kind of nice to have some human interaction. He was there picking up a caribou hunter who was being flown out along with a caribou. So 2 other people had, 2 rafts had come down the Charlie River that went in behind me, and these were big rafts. They've got the oars are mounted in oar pockets, and they've got big brackets that the seats are mounted to, and these are they're loaded down with, I don't know, 3 or 4 Yeti coolers per raft. Those big Yeti coolers. I mean, these are some pretty big vessels. So I go to the end of the runway, super surprised to run into this group of 4 hunters. One of them was a river guide, and so a professional guide, and those were his rafts, and this is what he does, and he's been on the Charlie River a number of times. And sure enough, one of his hunters had a caribou, and they were flying the caribou out from that Gelvin's cabin. So the guide asked me, he said, so how long have you been staying here at the cabin? And I said, well, I got in last night. And he says, when are you leaving? I said, well, I'm going to leave tomorrow morning. I'm going to hike up and look at this airplane, this wreckage. And he says, man, do you really know how far that is? I said, yeah, I know where it is. He's like, that's a long day. He's like, you can do it, but man, that's a really, really long day. He said, so who are you here with? And I said, no, just me, this is a solo trip. And he's like, really? Where did you come in from? And I kind of explained to him where I'd been dropped off and what I'd been through. And then he asked me, he says, hey, tell me more about your raft. And I said, well, it's a pack raft. And he says, can we take a look at it? I said, sure. So we walked over to where the raft was deflated on the bank of the river, because again, I get my gear out of that zipper, so the raft then is deflated. And the guy looks at it and he tells me, you know, most years this would probably be fine. He said, but this year, this water is really, really high. He says, and I am very nervous about you trying to take that raft down the rock garden. He says, I'm not saying you can't do it, but if you're going to do it, he said, I really, really think you should go in front of us and let us follow you through this section of the river, because this, you know, that could really be important, that there's someone right behind you as you try to navigate this particular stretch. So you know, that meant, but they were leaving, they weren't going to wait around till the following day. These guys were on, you know, wanting to get down those rapids that day. So I thought that the advice from this guy was pretty good. It was good, sound advice, and I felt a lot safer going down with him, even though I wasn't mentally prepared yet. All of a sudden now it seems like a much more responsible decision to go with a group. So as I'm getting my gear together, the guide comes back over to me and says, you know something? He says, I don't think you should even go down in front of us. Just pack up your gear, load it on my raft. He said, and why don't you float down this section with me? You know, join me and jump on my boat, and let's go down this thing together. And when we get through the worst of it, you know, then I'll let you off and you can go do your own, you know, macho man adventure stuff by yourself if that's what you want to do. But this really wouldn't be a good idea for you to take that thing. So I was really appreciative of that offer. That was very kind of him to make that offer. And so that I agreed to do it. So I loaded up my gear onto his raft and we floated down together. After having floated it, I'm sure glad that's how it worked out. I mean, I'm really glad that it just coincidentally, luck was on my side. And I was very, very privileged to have been able to safely navigate that stretch on a much more appropriate vessel for that type of water. My big regret about that whole situation is that when I got to the cabin, the fire is already all perfectly ready to be lit inside the wood stove. I mean, the paper's crumpled and the sticks and the twigs and the fire's all built, and all you have to do is light a match to it. And that's really the way you want to leave those public use cabins in Alaska, because the next person that gets there, you don't know what situation they're going to be in. They could be in a very, very bad situation and need to have that fire ready to go and ready for them to just strike the match and put a flame to it. And they could be in a situation that they don't have the energy or the capability of making the fire because of hypothermia or any other number of possible circumstances. So when these guys wanted to get on the river, the fire was still smoldering inside of the wood stove. And long story short, I didn't prepare the fire for the next user. I did have the wood box full of split logs and all that stuff, and there was some wax paper fire starter there, and I left some fire starters that I had brought along with me, like some emergency fire starters that I left there on the side of the wood box for the next user of the cabin. But it continued to kind of, you know, rub at my ethics that that I had received the cabin with this fire ready to go, and then I left it, you know, with a pile of ashes for the next person. So that was unfortunate. But when we got past the worst of the rapids, I asked this guide to pull over on this gravel bar, because that's where I intended to camp. And he did. And as I was getting the stuff unloaded, he was kind of walking around the gravel bar. Then he approached me and said, hey, this is a really nice spot. Would you mind if we camp here with you tonight? And I said, no, you know, the guy likely just saved my life. So I said, no, absolutely not. You know, it's public land. Obviously, you're welcome to camp wherever you want. So him and his two hunters camped on one side of this island, and I camped on the opposite side of the island. And that evening, I was glassing, and I saw a smallish caribou bull coming down the riverway. And so I snuck across the island into their camp, where they still had one hunter that had a caribou tag to fill. And I offered him the opportunity to hunt that caribou if he would like to. And the hunter was just ecstatic. You know, he's like, are you sure you don't want to shoot it? It was still a little bit early in the hunt for me, and I didn't want to have the meat quite that long. And I felt like it was the appropriate thing to do to give this guy the opportunity at that caribou. So he came with me, and we stalked our way around the island and got into position. And this young man, I would say 20-something, shot this caribou and made an exceptional shot on the caribou. His very first ever big game animal. He was an Alaska resident, lives in Anchorage, but hadn't been caribou hunting before, hadn't done any big game hunting before. He's a commercial fisherman, actually. But he shot the caribou, and so I was able to help him butcher the caribou and get it all broken down. And then I took my pack raft over to where the caribou was, and we loaded the meat all into my pack raft, and then I was able to float that meat back down to their camp. And then what's kind of interesting is they were there for a moose hunt. The guide himself had a moose tag and was going to be moose hunting, but it was still almost a week before moose season started. So I asked them, are you going to get this meat flown out, or what are you going to do with the meat? And they advised me that they had a strategy that they've used for a number of years, wherein they build a smoke shack and they spend days smoking the meat to preserve it, which is an interesting thing I hadn't seen or done before. But they seemed pretty confident with the technique and said they've used it for years. So after we got the caribou all back to camp, it was pretty late, so we went to bed. But the next morning I actually helped them to build, and I'll show you pictures of this, but I helped them to build a smoke shack out of lodgepole pines and things like that. We used the caribou hide as kind of a roof of this smoke shack, and then also covered it with some tarps and built a small fire underneath there. And their plan was to stay there for 4 days, feeding the fire and just continually providing a smoke to this meat so that they could preserve this meat for their extended trip. So I spent the following morning with those guys, and then loaded up my stuff and continued on my way. And on my way down to the Yukon River, I was able to harvest a caribou, a nice mature bull caribou. One thing that's interesting about the hunting technique is I was now in very densely forested areas. And so I'm in the caribou migration, and the caribou are coming through regularly, and I'm seeing a lot of caribou, but you really don't know when it's the end. Like at one point you're going to see a caribou, and that's going to be the last caribou you see on the trip. You're not going to see any more caribou. And those caribou are traveling in essentially the opposite direction that I was traveling. I'm going down the river and they're going up the river. So as they're passing me, I'm also moving my way closer to the back of the line, if you will. So anyway, I took this caribou bull, and then the following, I didn't get back to camp that night after I shot that caribou. I didn't get the meat broken down and back to camp and taken care of. It was 1:07 in the morning. I remember checking the time after I got all the meat back to my camp. It was 1:07 in the morning. I put everything about 150 yards away from my camp downwind, because now I'm traveling with approximately 200 pounds of grizzly bear bait and grizzly bear tracks, everywhere that a track can be left, essentially on a sandbar, gravel bar, area that's muddy or anything like that, you're going to find grizzly bear tracks. And so I did the best I could to try to create a situation where if a bear came to get the meat, they would definitely know my presence that I was there. They would be aware of my presence, and it wouldn't be kind of a surprise to them. I never did have any grizzly bear encounters. I never did see a grizzly bear, interestingly, compared to the amount of sign I saw. One thing I'll share a picture with here in a moment is a caribou that's torn up pretty good, because I came around a bend in the river and a pack of wolves was ripping on the belly of a female caribou. When the wolves saw me, the wolves scattered into the willows. I mean, they disappeared. It was like in a flash. Those animals are so elusive. The wolves disappeared. The caribou ran from the edge of the gravel bar that it was being drugged down on into the river, and stood in the river with its skin kind of hanging off and flapping in the water a little bit. It was a cow caribou. Part of me felt like the right thing to do would be to shoot that caribou. It was it was definitely injured, but it's illegal for a non-resident to shoot a cow caribou. For a resident, it's either sex, but non-resident has to be a bull. So I wasn't interested in breaking a game law, obviously. I also felt like as soon as I got out of sight, those wolves were going to be right back out of their, the woods, and they were going to finish the job. So it was a little interesting to experience that raw brutality of nature in that way. It was really a interesting experience, but it was something I won't forget. That's for sure. So now I have all this caribou meat. That's where the alpaca raft forager came in handy again, because again, with that zipper, I could put all of the meat inside the tubes, and that way that meat is right up against the ice cold water. So while I was traveling, all the meat's inside the tubes of the raft. When I would stop at night, I'm taking the meat out and hanging it up in the trees for two reasons. One is air circulation. I want to keep the meat dry, and I want the air circulating around it nicely. So it's hanging, and then I've got tarps over it to prevent it from getting rain or precipitation on the meat. Of course, it's all loaded in game bags. High quality game bags, incredibly important on a trip like this. You don't want to skimp on game bags. There's a lot of different brands that are high quality. I'm not here to promote specific brands or anything, but the brand I was using was Black Ovis, which I've been really, really happy with. But tag bags, caribou bags, there's a number of brands out there, but this is not, you do not want to use game bags you found at Walmart. That's for sure. But I'm taking it out so that I can hang the meat up at night and get the air circulation. The other thing, though, is I don't want the meat in my raft overnight. Part of me thought, you know what, I'm going to leave the meat in the raft and leave the raft on the water, just tied up nicely. So it's almost like being in a cooler. But my concern was that if a bear or a wolverine or any number of critters wanted to get at that meat, they would be destroying my raft in the process. So I really wanted to create a situation where no critter felt enticed to destroy my raft in an effort to get at the meat. So that's one of the reasons that I would take the meat out every single night and hang it up. And of course, the smell of the meat is still all over the raft. The raft is still covered in blood and all that kind of stuff. But I would put the raft kind of in the near proximity of the meat, but try to put it in a place where any animal would find it easier to just get the meat than to destroy a laminated, nylon material to get at the smells inside of the tubes of the raft. But that proved to be a lot of work. I mean, loading and unloading and setting up camp and then breaking down camp and loading and unloading and inflating the raft and so on and so forth was an incredible amount of work. It's really hard, and you're doing it in all kinds of various weather conditions, rain and wind and just crazy stuff. If I was going to be hiking for the day and not on the water floating, then what I would do is I would take the temperatures were kind of warm. So I would take the meat out of the raft. I would build a pallet out of like lodgepole pines. I'll show you pictures of it, but I basically build a wood pallet that would provide a lot of airflow underneath. I would put that wood pallet in the river so that the pallet's actually in the river, but the top of the pallet is above the water by about, anywhere 3 to 6 inches. I don't want any water from the river splashing onto the meat, but I want to load the meat on the pallet in such a way that there's air gaps between all of the different quarters and stuff, so that the meat's not touching it, that I don't have two game bags touching one another. Then I would construct a tent with my tarps over that, so that the super ice cold water flowing through this pallet and just inches underneath my game meat would act kind of like a refrigerator. It's like a backcountry refrigerator. That water, that super cold water moving underneath the meat and that tarp covering the meat from sunlight and keeping it shaded proved to be a pretty good strategy for keeping the meat cool during the daytime if I was not on the water. Again, I thought about, just putting it in the raft and leaving it on the water, but I just was not interested in having something bad happen to that raft, because I would really been in a bad situation if it had. So anyway, I had to deal with that caribou. I think 8 days it took me from the time I shot the caribou, might have been 8 or 9 days from the time I shot the caribou until I actually had it into a freezer. And I put it in a freezer of a native man's house in Circle. So On my way to the Yukon River, the Charlie River really slowed down a lot after those dangerous rapids I continue to talk about. So then it just became work, because now you have to paddle or you're just not going anywhere. It's a big, slow moving body of water and you have to paddle your way through it. I estimated that I probably had, with the Caribou, I was probably about 650 pounds with my body weight, my gear, and the weight of the Caribou on this raft. So I'm paddling about 650 pounds down the Charlie River until I ultimately reached the Yukon River. And that was another humbling experience, because the Yukon is a humongous river. And it's very humbling to be out in the middle of a river that's miles wide in some areas, some spots. And you're in this tiny little inflatable pack raft. The water's ice cold. I have no idea how deep it is. I mean, I would try to touch the bottom with my paddle, but obviously I could not touch the bottom. It was certainly deeper than my paddle was long. But I had these thoughts like, essentially this raft is made out of like a 1/16 of an inch thick nylon that's laminated and airtight, obviously. But I'm out in the middle of this river thinking, if this raft were to somehow deflate, I would be in a really, really bad situation, because with the temperature of that water, I couldn't have even swam to either bank on either side before becoming hypothermic and being useless, I don't think. Obviously, there's no reason that the raft would do that, but those thoughts still entered my mind. I'm like, man, I am really trusting my life with this fabric that I hope remains intact and doesn't deflate. My goal was, what I really wanted to do was stay closer to the bank. I wanted to be closer to the shore. So just in case anything happened, I'm not that far off the shore. But the challenge with that is that the water on the sides of the river is either not moving at all, or it seems like it's moving the opposite direction. Like you get these eddies around the banks. So in order to catch a current where you might be able to get 3 to 4 miles per hour of current speed on the water, you'd have to go pretty far away from the shore to actually hit that river current. So I found myself floating down essentially the middle of the Yukon River, which was, like I said, humbling experience. It's a very slow moving river. You're not dealing with rapids and whitewater and things like that. In fact, you're paddling a lot. You're really getting a workout. But it's still humbling to be on a body of water that large with such a dainty watercraft. But the alpaca raft performed flawlessly. I don't have a single complaint about it after the trip. I'm not paid to say that. I was super impressed, and I was really concerned, especially about that zipper, like I mentioned. On the Yukon River, I hit another public use cabin. This one's called Slavin's Cabin, and it's actually called Slavin's Roadhouse. It used to be a roadhouse, like a riverside hotel where miners primarily would stop and stay. And there's a family that lives there, works for the National Park Service, native family. They don't have electricity. They don't have running water. They're trappers. They live a very, very, very primitive lifestyle. Husband, a wife, and 2 fantastic children that I spent the night there at the cabin with them, and learned all about their family and learned about their way of life and what they do and how they do it. And it was fascinating. I mean, these kids are out there trapping, helping their parents, 7-year-old daughter, 10-year-old son, helping their parents in negative 70-degree temperatures, running this Alaska trap line. And the wife, Amanda, she's working the furs and turning them into wares and turning them into slippers and moccasins and things like that they sell, and that's how they earn money. And obviously they get a check from the Park Service for maintaining this public use cabin as well. But fantastic people, really enjoyed spending time with them. The son, the 10-year-old boy, took me on a tour. It was about a 3-mile trip back to an old dredge where they'd use for gold mining. It's no longer in operation, but this dredge has been abandoned. It's called the coal mine dredge, and it's just fascinating. I'll show you some pictures of it, but really enjoyed spending a little bit of time with these kids and seeing how different it is when a kid's not on a screen, when they don't have cell phones, they don't have electricity. Well, that's not exactly true. They have a battery operated radio, and They have a flashlight that, charges up on a solar panel thing. They listen to the radio at 9 o'clock every night. There's a radio station called Trapper Chatter, where if you wanted to convey a message to them, you call the radio station and you tell the radio station this message, and then the radio station reads all of the messages every night at 9 o'clock. For all of these remote trappers who live in super remote areas, the only way they can communicate with their loved ones or anybody is on Trapper Chatter. And it's I enjoyed listening to Trapper Chatter with these people, because it's kind of entertaining. You learn about everybody's dirty laundry. I mean, the trapper's wife is like on Trapper Chatter saying, when you get back, your stuff's going to be on the street. I found out what you did about this or that or whatever. And so all there for the world to hear. But the kids were just, it was so inspiring to see how hard they work and the level of work ethic and the amount of joy and happiness without a single video game in their life. These kids have never played Fortnite. They don't know what Fortnite is. And so they're building forts, and this 10-year-old boy has a collection of some of the coolest things you've ever seen that he just finds in the woods. And it's like old Pepsi cans and Coca-Cola cans and coffee canisters and just all of these things that he's collected that were left behind by miners. And he's created this museum quality collection. And he has a fort that he built, and it's got a moss roof on it, and the thing's waterproof. It's pouring rain, and he's inviting me into his moss fort, that's built with logs and built with, it's well constructed. This is a really well done thing. And he's made a stovepipe out of putting together those round coffee cans, and he found a can opener and take the bottom of the coffee cans off and put them together like they're jointed. I don't know how to explain it exactly, so that he can make a fire in his clubhouse, and it's overlooking the Yukon River. And the incredible stuff. And they pan for gold, and the kid has his gold pans, and he knows how to get gold out of the river. And again, he's 10 years old. And that's the way they live, and it's wonderful. And so I really enjoyed spending a little time with them. I eventually made it back to Circle, total one-way trip from where I got dropped off to Circle was about 200 miles, river miles, that is. The way rivers go in Alaska, especially, it's you almost have 2 river miles for every linear mile of distance traveled. I made it back to Circle. When I got back to Circle, I encountered another one of those COVID-19 signs that nobody's welcome here, do not come here, because there's a boat ramp. And people travel from Fort Yukon, which is not connected to a road in any way, but it's about almost 90 miles up the Yukon River. Further north on the Yukon River, you get to Fort Yukon, which is the next town. And since there's no highway there, people from Fort Yukon would have to travel on the river to get to Circle. And then from there's a highway if they wanted to, say, go to Fairbanks. Most people in Fort Yukon go to Fairbanks twice a year. And one of those times is right before winter, like now. But Circle had a sign making it perfectly clear that nobody was welcome there. So when I pulled up, I thought, oh boy, this is really going to get interesting. But now I need to get a ride back to Fairbanks also, so I can't hide in the bushes this time. I got to talk to some folks. But as it turned out, the people were phenomenal. I made some wonderful friends. The Native community was incredibly welcoming. I didn't get a ride, but my ride ended up being Steve Shannon, the same guy that dropped me off. I in-reached him and let him know I'd made it to Circle, and his response was, I'll get there as soon as I can, which I thought was pretty awesome. And as soon as he could was about 10 or 11 o'clock that night. And I was just kind of hanging out in Circle for that day, and was invited into the homes of the local community there and Native community, and they fed me and they really welcomed me, and it was fantastic. I really, really enjoyed it. Steve Shannon gave me a ride back to Fairbanks. I went to Sportsman's Warehouse to buy some coolers so I can load my meat in these coolers. The shelves at Sportsman's Warehouse were practically bare, the coronavirus and all that stuff. They have nothing over there. I did though I managed to find 3 coolers in town that were big enough to fit all of my meat. And so I put it in Steve Shannon's house in his freezer. So it was frozen solid. I then loaded it into the coolers and went to Alaska Airlines, and again, that airline is absolutely fantastic. They're just so accommodating. And anyway, I flew back to Albuquerque with my caribou and all my caribou meat and all that stuff, and was actually pretty surprised to be picked up by my wife. I thought she'd probably not remember me after that long of a trip, and if she did remember me, I didn't think it would be in a positive light. So when I left, we'd made arrangements for her to pick me up from the airport. When I got back, I assumed that she would have canceled all of those plans, and I was going to be calling people looking for a ride. But no, my wife and son showed up at the airport and picked me up, and now it's all a memory. So I really hope that there's some questions here. I can talk about all different kinds of things. It doesn't matter. I'm going to share my screen, and I'll just go through some pictures, but feel free to ask questions, chime in. I know that was a really long-winded story, and I appreciate you all sticking with me through it, because that was a lot of rambling on my part. But here, let's see. So I'm going to share the screen. Again, just feel free to interrupt with questions.
Hey, Jess.
Yes, sir.
Would 2 sets of game bags been a benefit?
I had 2 sets of game bags.
Did you?
Yeah, but you know, it would have been a benefit, because I should have at one point, at one point at the Slavin's Roadhouse, they have a screen shack. So they have a place where I can hang all the insects, are just the flies and the yellow jackets and everything are just crazy out there. So at Slavin's Roadhouse, they actually have a screen house. So I went into the screen house and I hung up all of the meat and then took it out of the game bag so that I could take the game bags down to the Yukon River and wash them, because I wanted to wash my game bags really good. But even with the river, I wasn't able to get those game bags super clean. It would have been good of me to a day or two, once the meat was dried out properly, to take off the old game bags and replace it with fresh game bags. Definitely would have been a good idea.
Also, what was the daily temperature?
Well, it ranged, very rarely got below freezing. So most of the time, the lows were like in the high 30s, low 40s, and the highs would creep all the way up some days into the 60s. Some days not as hot, but yeah, it wasn't uncommon to get highs in the low 60s and lows in the high 30s. And the biggest challenge I felt, and you'll see this when I get this video all put together, but is the precipitation. I took a pile of really heavy duty 3 mil black contractor cleanup bags, you know, those big contractor cleanup bags, about the heaviest duty ones you can find. I took some of those, and so sometimes I would have to take the meat out of the raft, put it in a contractor bag so that I could transport it to the area where I was going to hang it in a tree without it getting soaked in that very short distance from the boat to the tree, because it was just raining sometimes pretty ferociously. Other questions, guys? I'm going to scroll through some pictures, but feel free to ask questions as we get through. So there's the COVID sign that I shared earlier as well. This is Zach's airplane that he took me on. You can see those big balloon Tundra tires there. I think it's a Cessna 185, if I remember right. I'm not a plane expert, but I sat beside the pilot, not behind the pilot. Sometimes when you're flying in a smaller aircraft like a Super Cub, you would find yourself sitting behind the pilot. But in this case, I was actually sitting next to him, and we had headsets and everything on, but we couldn't communicate. There was no, they didn't have microphones, or you just have earphones to protect you from the noise of the engine. And flying over the area, flying to the spot where I got dropped off, I saw a phenomenal bull moose feeding out in the middle of the Charlie River. I didn't see any moose along my floating trip, though. I saw plenty of moose sign. I never did see any moose. I did see Steve Shannon and I saw moose on the drive back from Circle back to Fairbanks. We did encounter some moose on the road on that drive, but I probably could have seen moose had I been looking for them. You know, I was pretty caribou focused but I still was a little surprised that I didn't see any moose. But yeah, that's Zach's airplane there. This picture here is just a random picture as we're flying over one of the tributaries to the Charlie River. So this is as I'm on my way to get dropped off. This is kind of what the scenery looked like from the air. And I probably have a couple of hundred pictures, but I know everybody, you've been with me for a long time. It's 7 o'clock in the evening here and people have a life. So I'm going to go through only 26 that I've got here. So it won't take up your whole evening. This is where I got dropped off. This is the view. As soon as I got dropped off, I mentioned that feeling of solitude and peace and quiet when the plane has faded out of sight and the sound has faded out of earshot. This is what I was looking at. This is basically what I'm looking at is the direction I'm going to be going to get to that little 3-foot wide creek, that then I'm going to get to that creek and hang a right, the way that this picture is showing. So that creek runs right along the base almost of that hill that's in the distance, that closer hill in the distance. And JP and others on here who have spent time in Alaska will be able to recognize those tussocks as looking as though it's a beautiful grassy meadow that you're just going to walk right across, and it's just going to be a super enjoyable stroll across the landscape. And it might be hard to tell by the photo, but if you've ever dealt with tussocks in Alaska, those things are treacherous. If you try to step on top of those lumps, those round mounds, what happens is they bend over. They kind of like fall over under your weight and try to break your ankle or roll your ankle or twist your knee out of position. Or they really try to mess you up bad if you try to walk along the tops of them. But if you walk in between them, you're walking on a wet sponge, and places your foot's going to sink 12 to 16 inches into the tundra there. So getting across this stuff, I know on the photo, it just looks really dreamy, and you can imagine yourself just carelessly strolling across that stuff, but it's actually much more difficult than it appears. So this here is just one of my various camps that I was making along the tributary of the Charlie River. So that tent there is a Hilleberg Nalo 2 tent. One of the things I really love about that tent is that it's got a double wall design so that you don't get condensation inside of the inner tent. Excellent for that. It's also excellent for keeping mosquitoes out. I've had tents where even with the zippers closed, somehow mosquitoes, I have no idea how, but somehow they can get inside of a tent. I never had an issue with any insects being able to get inside of this tent. One of the drawbacks of this tent is you absolutely cannot pitch this tent without staking the heck out of it. I mean, it takes a lot of stakes to set up this tent, and it's not like a typical dome tent where if the conditions are right and it's not super windy, you can set your shock corded aluminum poles and set up a dome tent without having to even stake it at all in some cases. Sometimes people just stake out the 4 corners of a tent. This tent, in order to be effective, takes a lot of stakes. But the stakes I'm using are an MSR groundhog stake. They're super lightweight, but it does take a little time to set this thing up. I probably, and I set that thing up every single day generally. I do it a lot, and so I'm pretty quick at it, but I would say it still takes me 25 minutes to get that tent set up, where other tents I've had I can set up faster. But I don't think I've ever had a tent more bulletproof than that. You can see my little, it's called a Helix, or I don't know, that little camp chair there. And then I've got my tripod set up with my spotting scope on it. That's a Vortex Razor spotting scope. And I'm looking at caribou on those ridges. So if you look at the pine trees in the background of this picture, you'll see that far ridge on the left. It's over a mile away. I don't know exactly how far, but this is what I was looking at. And this is just one caribou. There was a bunch of caribou all over that ridge. But this is through the phone scope, and roughly, I don't know, some distance over a mile away, taken through the phone scope. This is a cow caribou. And that's just what I was spending my time at camp, just watching wildlife from a distance. One thing I'll mention about the caribou I killed, I used a Hornady all copper bullet. And I know that there's some controversy around, lead and whether or not, it's really a big issue. But in this particular area especially, I would say that it's a big deal because there are a lot of raptors. I mean, I was finding wolf-killed caribou pretty regularly, and they would be covered up with bald eagles. There were a lot of merlins that were feeding on some of those caribou carcasses. I saw a Harris hawk. Anyway, there were some peregrine falcons. So there's a lot of raptors, and they definitely do feed on those gut piles. I used an all copper bullet, did the trick. I mean, I shot that caribou. Of course, my shot was about probably 40 yards or 45 yards. It wasn't a real long shot. I was using a 30-06. I think it's 185 grain Hornady guide bullet, it's called. Nothing fancy about the rifle or the setup. It had a vortex scope on it. And again, it's just a Remington 700 30-06. I was sighted in 2 inches high at 100 yards, but the shot turned out to be 40 yards. I really wanted to take my bow. Initially, I wanted to take my bow on the trip. The reason I took a rifle instead was simply because I felt like there was more weight involved with taking my bow. I thought I would need my bow, and I was going to take a field repair kit. Then I decided I better take an extra string in case you break a string. And then the more I kind of contemplated it, I just thought that the possibility of something going wrong with equipment would be greater with my compound bow than it would be with a rifle. After that very first rafting incident, it's very possible, had I had my compound bow strapped to the top of that raft, the way I had it strapped, JP, when you and I were on our moose hunt, there's a real possibility that thing would have been destroyed the first afternoon I got dropped off, in which case I would have still had a phenomenal trip, but it would have would have not included the taking of a caribou likely. So that's the reason I took the rifle. But then I still enjoyed the experience of getting within bow distance of the caribou. So kind of best of both worlds there. This is a picture from that first camp where I stayed the night I flipped the raft. I don't know, that's not exactly where I flipped the raft. I was just taking a walk the following morning and snapped that photograph. But that's the type of rapids that caused me to flip over. I just came over one of those boulders, and the raft just was too top heavy. I was too off balance, flipped over and took a swim. In New Mexico, if you're in a group with people and you're rafting in the Rio Grande and you fly off the raft, it's kind of part of the experience. It's kind of fun, and it's not maybe as scary. But when you're alone in a very, very far off place, the water is really frigid, and you're counting on all your equipment to not get lost or broken. And some minor issue like a sprained ankle or a broken arm or something could result in a pretty serious challenge to get yourself out of this area. It is a little bit more, I guess, unnerving than maybe it would have been under different circumstances. So this is that caribou. You can see the skin I've got a bunch of other pictures too, but this, you can see the skin kind of hanging down. This is where I watched a wolf tugging on the bottom of that caribou's belly and just ripping that skin off of the rib cage or the stomach of the caribou there. And again, the wolves retreated into the willows that are behind the caribou, into all that dense brush. I continued floating on down, and I'm pretty confident that as soon as I got out of sight, the wolves probably came right back out and finished the job on that caribou. Again, I was seeing caribou carcasses pretty regularly on the gravel bars along the banks of the river. I mean, there's an interesting story about these caribou. This is the 40-mile caribou herd, and it's estimated right now to be at about 85,000 animals. 1996, it was estimated to be about 2,600 animals. So in 1996, there were 2,600 of these in this herd. And that's when they started huge restoration efforts. The state of Alaska started a very massive restoration effort to try to bring the herd back. All hunting of this caribou herd stopped at the time. It was illegal to hunt the caribou. In a very, very controversial decision, the state of Alaska started an aggressive aerial gunning program. where they were gunning down predators from the air, trying to reduce the wolf population primarily, but also bears. And the result was now the herd's at 85,000. I met with Alaska Department of Game and Fish. It's their goal to reduce the herd by 10,000. They say they're currently about 10,000 animals over objective. They'd like to be closer to 70 to 75,000 caribou. So they offer a whole bunch of tags to residents and subsistence hunters and those kinds of things. Also, the residents can kill bulls or cow caribou. Non-residents can only kill a bull caribou. I didn't even need a tag for wolves in this unit had I, had the desire or interest. I could have. I couldn't have never had a situation where I had an option to shoot a wolf. Like, that opportunity never presented itself, and I had no interest personally in shooting a wolf anyway. But the states, from what I understand in talking with the department, they're no longer doing the aerial gunning, but they are very, very liberal with allowing people to hunt and trap wolves and bears in this area. In fact, this area also recently opened up to grizzly bear baiting, which is not allowed in many areas of Alaska. The resident limit for black bears in this area is 5. So a resident can get 5 black bears in a license year. Grizzly bear tags are over the counter. There's no restrictions on shooting bears with cubs. There's just really strong attempts by the state game department to manage the predators in this particular area. From what I could tell based on sign, there are plenty of predators out there. But again, I wasn't interested in shooting a wolf or anything like that, but you could tell that the wolves are definitely having an impact on the population. But the population, again, is still 10,000 animals over objective in this particular herd. Now, the Alaska Department of Game and Fish did tell me that the reason they're trying to reduce the population is because the caribou don't have enough to eat, that they're over foraging the tundra. And I can tell you that the caribou that the guy shot that I helped him get that little caribou, and the caribou that I shot were very, very healthy. I mean, the layers of fat on these caribou, I've never seen an elk or deer in my life with layers of fat like that. Obviously, they're a different animal, and they live in a completely different region and climate zone. So I recognize that that's not comparing apples and oranges, but just based on my very limited observation, it didn't appear that the caribou I was seeing were having any trouble finding food. But that is the reason that Alaska Game and Fish cited for wanting to reduce the population, is that there's not enough forage for the animals. So there's that. Let's see. Speaking of forage, there's one of my staples there. One of my daily dietary staples was blueberries. There were big, plump, juicy blueberries all over the place, which was nice because the bears had plenty to eat, that they didn't bother me. There was plenty of food for everybody. So here's a picture of this is the tributary of the Charlie River again. This is just me rafting down the river and taking a picture with my cell phone and hoping like heck I don't drop it in the river. The entire time I was taking a lot of pictures with my cell phone. I also took a lot of video footage with a camcorder that I brought along. I haven't yet taken the card out of that camera and put it on the computer and worked on editing. And I got a lot of work to do once I get caught up with real work. But I did take a tremendous number of photos. But this was the type of scenery as I get out of the high country, out from above timberline, where you're seeing I'm entering the more forested, densely forested area. There's a lot of black spruce there, a lot of birch trees. Really just fantastic scenery all the way around. Then this next picture here is Gelvin's cabin. So this is actually the morning before that pilot showed up that kind of saved my hide a little bit. But yeah, this is the little trapper cabin that I was able to stay at for one night. I had plans to stay there for 2 nights, like I mentioned, but the circumstances were such that I got 1 night there and then hit the rapids with my lucky friends that I met coincidentally at that landing strip or that gravel bar in front of the cabin there. This is a small caribou that the guy shot that I mentioned. And so this is taken right after I went upriver and put this stuff on my pack raft, and then rafted it down to those guys' camp where we unloaded it. And then after we got it all unloaded, it was kind of late in the day at that point, so we didn't actually build the smoke shack till the following morning. But this is a picture of the inside of that smoke shaft, or smoke shack. And what you got there is just all of the quarters and ribs and everything hanging up from the ceiling of this little structure that we built. And you can tell the structure is all built with lashing together, poles, pine poles that we've lashed together with paracord and stuff, and hanged it all from the ceiling, or hung it all from the ceiling, and then put the caribou hide over top of it, and then wrapped it with 2 tarps in addition to the hide. The tarps go all the way to the ground, so it creates a full enclosure there. And then on the ground, we make a small fire and feed it primarily with green wood. Once you have a good bed of coals, putting a lot of green wood, creating a bunch of smoke. If you put your head in that thing, you wouldn't be able to breathe once we've got that smoke going. Those guys, I haven't talked to them. I did exchange information with them, so they plan to keep in touch. I'm interested to hear, how the rest of their trip went, but haven't heard from them yet. But they said they were going to sit there and just keep that fire going, really smoky fire for 4 days to get all of that meat cured so that it would last for the duration of their trip, which was going to be almost 3 more weeks after this photo was taken. So they were going to be out there with that meat for a really long time. They were very confident this strategy was going to work. I've never tried it, so I'm not necessarily promoting it, but it was interesting to experience. This picture is just a screenshot from a video that I have on my phone. This is just a young caribou bull that I passed on at one point. It's a really neat video. You'll see it whenever I get the film put together, but this caribou walked essentially right up to me. I could have probably flicked him with my finger, and then he caught my wind, and his reaction when he caught my wind was kind of comical. It was pretty funny. I mean, that guy jumped in the air, and he didn't like the smell of me, but after being in the wilderness for as long as I was, probably nobody would have liked the smell of that. So this is the caribou that I shot. I did not skin out the whole head to do a European mount. I just kind of cut off the skull cap because I was really concerned about the weight. And the truth is, I was really there for the adventure and for the experience, and obviously for the meat. The antlers weren't my top priority. So when I got an opportunity later, I stripped all of the velvet off of them, and they're sitting on a picnic table in my backyard currently, but I'll put them on display somewhere, somehow. But I wanted to minimize, all of my focus and concern was on trying to do my very, very best job taking care of that meat. And so dealing with a skull to later make a European mount out of or something like that wasn't something that was high on my priority list. This is a picture of the pallet, one of the wooden pallets that I mentioned that I would build to keep the meat cool. I would create a platform similar to this one, and then lay all of the meat out on top of it with it out over the water. So you can see here, I've got the meat. I don't know if you guys can see my cursor when I share the screen or not, but you can see I've got the meat inside of that tarp. I've got that pallet inside of that tarp, and it's completely shaded, so there's no opportunity for the sun to beat on those game bags. And then the sides of the tarp are actually submersed under the water and secured with large boulders so that the water can freely flow underneath that kind of A-frame design, which would get really nice airflow through that tarp. And I had a meat thermometer, so I was able to actually continually check temperatures. And so I could put that thermometer just not in the meat, but just set it inside of my little backcountry refrigerator and see that in the middle of the day, even if it was 63, 64 degrees outside, I was in 40 degrees inside of that little fridge. So, if it was up to me, I would have asked for colder temperatures, but not having that option, I just had to do the best I could with what I had to work with. So that's what this photo here is showing, is my backcountry refrigerator. Moving on to the next one, this is on the Charlie River. So this is after the rapids, obviously. That's why I have a caribou on there, because I wasn't going to take a caribou until the rapids calmed down and the river became much more floatable and a little less of an adrenaline junkies style. So this is just floating down the Charlie River as I'm headed towards the Yukon. I think at this point I'm probably about 20 or 25 miles from the intersection of the Yukon River. I saw a lot of Dall sheep in there, tremendous number of Dall sheep, but all small rams and ewes. I later learned that the disease, that Imovi disease, has gone in there a few years ago and nearly wiped out the Dall sheep population. And that's the reason that all the sheep that I was seeing were young, because apparently the population is rebounding really well, but they've lost the big mature rams to the Imovi outbreak a few years back. At least that's what I was told. So then at night, again, I would take the meat out of the raft and then hang it up as best I could. Those quarters are heavy. A caribou bull, a mature caribou bull like the one I shot, weighs, I would say, about the same as a big mature cow elk. They're not small animals. I mean, it's not like dealing with a mule deer or something. It's a big, heavy animal, and so those quarters are really heavy. So I'd hoist them up as high as I can, but that's not going to protect the meat from bears or anything else. It's just to provide air circulation, keep the meat dry. If a bear had wanted that meat, a bear could have easily gotten that meat. But as I mentioned, that didn't become an issue at any point during this trip. There were a few obstacles that I had to get out and kind of hike around, which wasn't that big of a deal. It was fairly short hikes and not a big deal. But this is the caribou rack that's on my backpack. I'm carrying a Kafaru Reckoning pack in this picture, and anyway, it's a great pack. I really think highly of it and did a great job on this trip. Super durable, and I'd fly around with that thing, and the airlines can beat it up as much as they want, and it doesn't have any problems. It can just very, very tough piece of equipment. This is a picture of the raft when it's fully loaded. Again, with this raft here probably weighs right about 450 pounds because I'm not in it. I'd add another couple hundred pounds, but I've got all of the meat loaded inside of the tubes of the raft. I've also got my tent, a bunch of equipment loaded in the tubes. The only thing I would leave outside of the raft, like that duffel bag, and then you see that green dry bag there, those are items that I might use throughout the day. So I've got my rain gear in there so that if it starts raining, I don't have to stop and deflate the raft to access my rain clothing. I have it easily accessible. I have, some snacks for lunch and things like that, easily accessible. Anything, my spotting scope, binoculars, anything I think I might want to use throughout the day, I would put on top of the raft. Anything that I thought I wasn't going to need until I stopped to make camp, that goes inside the tubes of the raft. That created a very, very stable platform for me to float on. And one thing that was interesting is I was very concerned because I did the best I could in dealing with the meat to not have any sharp edges and things like that. But when all your gear's in the tubes, sometimes you have a weird angle and you see like this item kind of pushing and putting pressure on the wall of the raft, on the wall of the tube, and it would look a little misshapen. That made me kind of nervous, but the reality is it never became an issue of any kind. You can see the way I've looped that rope through all the D-rings around the whole perimeter of the raft. That's the rope that I grabbed onto on the two occasions that I found myself accidentally outside of the raft. So these are just some tenderloin steaks that I cut up and cooking them on the campfire. And the oil that's in the pan is actually rendered caribou fat. And I don't know what it is about caribou fat that's different than, say, elk or mule deer fat, but I don't think I would take elk fat and melt it down and then cook an elk steak inside the elk fat. I tend to, when I'm processing wild game that I harvest in New Mexico, trim those parts off. But the caribou fat is just amazing. It melts down and turns into this just very flavorful. It's not waxy in any way. And I use that as a cooking oil throughout the trip, and it really worked wonderfully. I mean, it's incredible flavors. It's excellent meat quality on these caribou. There's, just a picture of the steak from the inside. this picture here is of the Yukon River. So you can see what I'm talking about. It's a massive river. That's me somewhere in the middle of the river looking across to one side. It's probably about the same distance across if I was to look the opposite direction. And that's pretty intimidating when you're just in a tiny little raft. I assumed that when I got on the Yukon, I was going to be seeing all kinds of boat traffic. I thought, man, there'll be motor boats speeding up and down and salmon fishermen, and there'll be people all over the place. Thought maybe the state troopers would come and check my Caribou tags. And the reality is I saw 2 boats in all of the days I was on the Yukon, I think 4 or 5 days. I saw 2 boats, and both of those boats were almost when I got to Circle. And the boats were on the clear opposite side of the river where in the instance I needed help, if I didn't have a flare gun, which I didn't have, I don't know how I could have even gotten those boats' attention because I doubt they could have seen me in my little raft. But anyway, yeah, so there was definitely no boat traffic on the Yukon River. So I was out there all by myself, just experiencing the wonders of nature, watching bald eagles fly overhead and things like that. It was really incredible. The water is very silty though, it's very brown. The Charlie River is crystal clear. You can look down to see every piece of gravel on the riverbed of the Charlie River, even where it's 15, 20 feet deep. I mean, and it does get that deep, or at least deeper than my paddle. There are numerous places on the Charlie River where I could not touch my paddle to the bottom of the riverbed. When you look into the water, you'd think it was an inch deep. I mean, it just so crystal clear. Once you get past all of those whitewater rapids, obviously up in the rapids, it's just a giant whitewater, aerated, non-transparent waterway. But once you get down to where it slows down, it's really fascinating to look down and look in the water. And I saw a northern pike that, gosh, he had to have been close to 5 feet long. This thing was enormous. I saw this pike just swimming in the water. Fascinating, huge fish. This is Slavin's Roadhouse. This is the second of the 2 public use cabins that I stayed at, again, managed by the National Park Service. And this is the house where that family lives that I mentioned, and lives a very, very primitive lifestyle. Excellent people, wonderful people, and terrific kids. And then last photo I've got here on today's slideshow is this picture here of this kid's fort. And you can't see it because it's not shown in the picture, but I wish I would have taken a picture of the stovepipe he made out of the coffee cans to replace. If you see my cursor, this was his original stovepipe. And this was an actual stovepipe that he found in the woods or salvaged from an old cabin, or I have no idea what. But this was actually a stovepipe, but it's all rusted out and destroyed. But the kid over the years has managed to collect enough of those big round Folgers coffee cans and stuff, and Maxwell House, and I've got pictures of all that stuff, but just not in this slideshow. But anyway, when I was there, he was working on replacing his stovepipe with a new stovepipe. And for a 10-year-old kid to be working on that, I thought was pretty awesome. You know, he was very imaginative young man and super enthusiastic about the outdoors. So it was really fun to share time with him. So that's all I've got, guys. Those are all the pictures. I'm going to have a video for everybody at some point once I get caught up on work. The one thing that's difficult is coming back from a multi-week trip where you don't have services and communication capabilities, and then trying to get caught up on work. That's a really tough thing to do, but that's what I'm in the middle of working on right now. Any other questions? Is there any other? Oh, I see Seth Heath asked a question here in the comments. He said, what kind of rain gear did you use? And what I've got is Sitka Jetstream, it's called. It's called Sitka Jetstream rain gear. I really like it because it works super well. It does have some downfalls. One of them is that it's fairly noisy. If you're bow hunting, it's difficult to stalk when you're bow hunting if you're wearing that Jetstream rain gear. The other thing is it's really heavy. I should weigh it so I know exactly what it weighs, but it's a pretty heavy rain gear. But when you're dealing with as much precipitation as I was dealing with, you kind of decide, you know what, I'll accept the noise and I'll accept the weight if it'll keep me dry, and it definitely does keep you dry. So it's a good high quality product. not inexpensive. You know, that Sitka stuff is pretty expensive. I don't know what I spent on that rain gear. I can't recall, but I do know I bought it off of Camo Fire at some point. So whatever I paid was probably like 40% off of what retail price would be. Camo Fire, sometimes you can find really good deals on there. Let's see. So I've got a couple other, let's see, some comments here. Well, appreciate all of the kind words everybody's sharing here. Thank you very much for doing that. Appreciate the encouragement. Kent, thanks for everything. Kent Salazar is with us tonight, and Kent is actually the chair-elect of the National Wildlife Federation. So really, really appreciate Kent's conservation service. The things he does for our community is really, really wonderful. So thanks for all your hard work, Kent. Oh, it looks like Kent's hunted caribou also. So that's really, really cool. Oh, Ben in the photos. Thanks, Ben. Sorry I didn't see your comment before. I was probably too slow to get to him. Dr. Karl Malcolm, great to hear your feedback, and thanks for joining us also. Really, really appreciate that. All right, other questions, guys? Anything that I didn't cover that you wish I would cover? Seth again asking about the video. I'm really sorry I really wanted to have that video ready to roll out by now, but work has been incredible. Ben's asking me what was the total cost, and let's see, as long as my wife doesn't see this recording, I can probably answer that. Actually, I don't know, I'd have to tally it up, but it was $303 for the commercial airfare, $3,500 for the bush plane flight, $960 in tags, licenses, permits, etc. And I think you could get away with a little bit cheaper on that, because like I could have bought a couple of 7-day fishing licenses instead of a full year's fishing license, and that would have shaved off some money. And I could, for someone who spends the time, you can shave off a little. It doesn't have to be $960, but that's what I spent. Alaska Department of Game and Fish is really hurting this year as a result of coronavirus and this COVID and their fishing season. They did not have the tourism hunting season. They're just in really bad shape. So I didn't, become a penny pincher when I was buying my licenses and tags. I really appreciate the hard work of the fine men and women of the Alaska Department of Game and Fish. Let's see, I really owe a huge, I don't think he's with us tonight on the call, but Tyler Sladen, those of you that know Tyler Sladen, he kept my dog for me. He did me a favor and watched Estella and actually worked with her a lot and trained her and took her out and chased wild birds. And I was just so excited to get home and see my poodle pointer, and she didn't even want to come with me. She had so much fun with Tyler and his whole pack of dogs that she was like, leave me here. But that was a huge help, having Tyler watch my pup. And Steve Shannon, again, gave me a lift. Otherwise, I would have had to spend money on a rental vehicle. And last time we rented a U-Haul for a couple of weeks, JP, what was that, about $1,800, it seems like in my mind. Is that right? He's on mute. You're muted, JP. I can't hear you.
No, I don't think it was that much, but it was hundreds and hundreds.
Well, it probably wasn't that much, but you told me my half was $900. That's probably the total cost. So maybe I paid the total cost, and you just told me that was half. When JP and I did our trip, JP took care of just about all of the planning, preparation, everything. And then on this trip, I didn't do any planning or preparation because I didn't think I was going, so it was kind of a mess. But that was a big expense that someone might have to incur if they did a trip like this. Now, I will mention Senator Martin Heinrich was up there at the same time I was up there, and he was actually hunting in the same preserve. He was also in the Yukon-Charlie Rivers National Preserve. He was hunting with Steve Ranella, and Senator Heinrich took his 2 sons, and Steve Ranella took his 10-year-old boy, and they did a completely different trip. So they flew to a ridge, and this is, if a person really just wants to get a caribou, what you do is you talk to the bush pilots, and the bush pilots are flying over the country all the time, and they know where the caribou are moving and where they're migrating and where the herd is at any given time. So what they do is they fly you to a ridge in advance of where the caribou are. So they fly you to a ridge where the caribou are headed. you set up camp and you wait for the herd to come through your camp and you select your caribou and harvest your caribou that way. Then you're not setting up camp, tearing down camp, having giant rafting disasters, risking your life, all those kinds of adventurous things. You're kind of hanging out in a camp that's on top of a ridge and watching caribou all the time. But when I got back to Fairbanks, I actually went and met with Senator Heinrich and his sons. So we had lunch together, and he told me, he said, you know, when I was out there for a week and a half, I think, before he came out, but he said, man, when we flew over that Charlie River, he said, I couldn't believe that was a Charlie, because I looked down, I said, there's no way that's the river Jesse's floating down. That can't be right. And he said, when we landed, I asked the pilot, was that the Charlie River? And the pilot said, well, yeah. And Senator Heinrich said, well, is that the only Charlie River around here? Because that doesn't seem like the kind of a river a guy ought to be going down by himself out here. And so we had a couple good laughs about that, because he got a kick out of my lack of planning. The reality about the water level, though, is that you can't really plan. The conditions could have been such that the water level was too low for me to float, and I would be on here crying and complaining about the fact that I dragged my raft half the trip instead of floating the raft. It just so happens that the conditions aired on the opposite extreme, and the water level was as high as it's been in most people's memory that I spoke with. So if you were to do this trip, this exact same trip next year, the conditions could be very, very different. And the conditions can change daily out there. The ground is 100% saturated with water. Underneath the tundra, you have a layer of permafrost. So when there's precipitation, it goes into the rivers. So based on current rainfall, water levels fluctuate. So again, this is a trip. If you watch the film that Steve Firth put together called, again, that's The Heart of Hunting. You can find it on YouTube. Caribou, do-it-yourself Caribou float trip, it's called. You can see that they had situations where there wasn't enough water to float the raft and they had to do some dragging. My situation was the opposite of that. So as far as cost goes, Ben, I know I didn't summarize it with a single figure, but if you added up those numbers that I shared, that would pretty well cover it. Obviously, I didn't incur the cost of a guide because I didn't use a guide. Last time I went to Alaska with JP, we rented rafts, and if I recall correct, renting a raft for that length of time was nearly $1,000. And my memory may not be exactly right on that, but I think it's pretty pricey. And the alpaca forager raft is like $1,800, I think, something like that.
So
how much is it?
it was $1,200.
Our raft rental?
Yeah, it was $1,200.
So we rented a raft for $1,200. I bought a raft for $1,800. So if you're going to do the trip only once, you can save money by renting a raft. But if you think you might do more than one trip or want to use the raft in your local waterways, I strongly recommend that alpaca raft. And when I called Thor Tingley about that raft, it's a BHA model. You notice that like Kuyu camo pattern that's on it and all that. A portion of the proceeds goes to benefit backcountry hunters and anglers. But they come in two material types, and that's the lighter of the two. That raft weighs 13 pounds, 8 ounces. So it's 13.5 pound raft when it's deflated. The rafts that JP and I rented weighed 50 pounds a piece. That was a Legend made by Pristine Ventures. But I called Thor and I said, man, a 13-pound raft, I don't think that's going to be reliable enough for what I'm doing. I mean, I'm relying heavily on that. I said, give me the thicker material. They come in two different thicknesses or durabilities of material. And he said, no, you don't want that one. You want the light one. I said, I don't think so, Thor. I think I need the heaviest duty thing you've got. I need, the one that's going to be the most willing to withstand a puncture, withstand ripping and tearing. I'm not an experienced rafter. I come around a sharp turn and I fly into the side of the bank and there's exposed sticks and roots and trees and rocks and all kinds of stuff. I wanted the heaviest duty thing, and Thor basically said, no, that's not what you want. This is bomb proof. This thing is going to serve you very, very well. And he said, it's not even the weight I'm most concerned about, it's the packability. He said, you get that thicker material, you can't pack the raft down into a small enough manageable size that you could put it in your backpack or strap it to your backpack. We label it a pack raft, but it's kind of too big for that, quite frankly. He said, you know, if you were a guide and you were going to inflate the raft and put it on a trailer and leave it on the trailer all the time, you know, I would recommend that raft. But for what you're talking about, this is what you need. And when I got it, I'm inspecting the material and stuff and looking at this zipper, this giant zipper that's supposed to be airtight. And I had real concerns. In fact, I even called Randy Newberg because Randy's got a partnership with Alpaca Raft, and asked Randy, you know, have you had experience with this zipper? And he said, yeah. And I basically said, you know, do you, should I have concerns about this? I'm going to rely on that thing for weeks in Alaska on a remote solo trip. I cannot afford to have problems. He said, you have nothing to worry about. And turned out that was all true. So anyway, I would suggest if anybody's interested in rafting or pack rafting or anything like that, I just highly recommend Alpaca Raft. They're also very, very conservation minded. I actually met Thor Tingley when I was in Washington, D.C. testifying in front of Congress at the request of Deb Haaland. So Representative Haaland invited me out there, and Thor Tingley was at the hearing in the Longworth House in Congress. He was at the hearing listening to this conversation and this testimony about, you know, outdoor recreation, basically. So they're very in tune with conservation issues. Awesome company, awesome product. If you're going to go on more than one trip, buy the raft. Don't rent the raft. If anybody wants to borrow my raft at any point, let me know. I mean, otherwise it's inflated, hanging in the roof in the ceiling of my shed. So I'm so confident with that thing's durability that I'd be happy to loan it out to anybody that wanted to borrow it. Let's see, then John Pierce asked if I had a waterproof rifle case, and the answer is yes, I did. I had a rifle case that was made by Voodoo Tactical, and just because I couldn't find one locally, Cabela's, Sportsman's, everybody's shelves are bare. So I went on Amazon. I found a rifle case that was made by Voodoo Tactical that's heavy duty plastic, and then it has a roll top, just like you would have with a regular dry bag. You roll the top a few times and then buckle it with a plastic buckle. The rifle case was $19.99, so it was 20 bucks. And it worked, well, I mean, it worked excellent. Even when, so after I got my raft out of the water, it'd been upside down, all my gear, you know, they were in dry bags, but all those dry bags have been submerged for quite a few minutes. One of my first thoughts was I better open up that rifle case and see if there's water in there. And it was dry as a bone inside of that waterproof rifle case. So that worked out really well. Scott Carpenter's asking me, what's my next trip and when? That's probably a question for my wife. And the answer might be never. You know, locally, I drew a really great elk tag in Unit 16B. And that hunt is October 10th through the 14th. So I'll be down on the Gila mid-October. I drew a deer tag in Unit 27 in the Peloncillo Mountains. That's a Coos whitetail tag in November. Both of those are rifle tags, and I generally bow hunt. The reason I applied for rifle hunts this year is because they're shorter, and I knew after taking off so much time, I essentially took off the month of August. I knew that after taking a month off of work, I wasn't going to have a lot of available time off to dedicate to other bow hunting trips. So for that reason, I applied for pie-in-the-sky rifle hunts that I had no expectation of drawing, and lo and behold, I drew two of the best tags I've ever had in my life, and now I got to beg for permission to go on those hunts after being away for so long. As far as Alaska goes, I can't wait to get back. I've lived in Alaska. I wouldn't want to live there. I absolutely love everything about New Mexico, and given the choice, I would choose New Mexico over any other state, period, always, no matter what. But for vacationing, for these types of trips, Alaska is really a wonderful place. And I would be more than happy to do this exact same trip again. I don't think I have the desire anymore to prove anything to myself about doing it solo. I think next time I go, I'll probably go with somebody else who's willing to do the trip with me. I'm glad that I did it as a solo trip. I think that was great, but there were a number of instances that one very minor difference could have had catastrophic results, and the outcome could have been drastically different than what it was. So I consider myself very fortunate that things went the way they did, and probably wouldn't do that solo. Oh, Hans asked me an awesome question here because, of course, he's a restaurateur, an entrepreneur. In fact, they've got, if you haven't looked up their new business venture in Santa Fe, it's incredible. It's all high-end cuisine stuff. It's really cool. But so he naturally asks if my lack of fishing messed up meal planning. The answer to that is not really. I was planning on eating a lot of fish, but in 2016, JP and I, we really planned our meal planning around eating fish. I mean, that was what we expected to be consuming on that trip. And as it turned out, we never caught one single fish. We never even saw one single fish. And so we ended up on some pretty tight rations on that trip. I mean, we were trying to make stew out of beef jerky, and I mean, we were just having to really get creative with finding food. I mean, we probably ate, I don't know, 100 pounds of blueberries each at least, maybe more. We were fortunate to kill some ptarmigan, and so we were able to dine on those ptarmigan. But this time, I'd heard that the Charlie was great for fishing, but after not having caught a single fish on the trip with JP, I brought enough food that if I didn't catch any fish, I was still gonna be fine. So didn't really mess up my meal planning, although I would have loved to consume some fresh fish. I also would have loved to consume some grouse or ptarmigan. And so I actually brought along with me, I borrowed from my brother a pistol called Governor, and it's made by Smith & Wesson, and it shoots 45 Colt rounds, which I thought would be helpful for, bear protection. I also had bear spray, as I mentioned. But I had some 45 Colt rounds, and then I also had some 410 shotgun rounds in size number 6. Before I went out on the trip, I took that little pistol out and patterned it. And my intent was to hunt grouse and or ptarmigan. So as I started off in the high country, you're more prone to see ptarmigan. As you travel to lower elevations, you're much more likely to see grouse. You're going to see dusky grouse or spruce grouse in the lower elevations. So in any case, I had that quote unquote shotgun with me to do some grouse hunting. I never did see a grouse. There are plenty there for sure, but I, quite frankly, like I said, I didn't have a lot of time for exploratory recreation is what I'm saying. So by the end of the day, I mean, I'm so exhausted. I'm completely beat. I'm tired that walking around and looking for a grouse it just didn't happen. I probably would have run into quite a few had I had the opportunity to go hike up to that plane wreckage. That area would have, I think, produced a lot of birds. But anyway, the way it worked out was perfect. But yeah, so meal planning, it was almost all Mountain House until I got the Caribou. In fact, it was Mountain House, Alpine Air, and Backcountry Kitchen were the brands that I had. It turns out that I only needed to buy 2 breakfasts before I left on the trip. I just have a big stash of dehydrated meals in my hunting shack at the house. So I just happened to have everything I needed pretty much. Bought a couple of breakfasts to take with me, but it was almost all dehydrated foods until I got the Caribou, in which case I was eating the Caribou and still some dehydrated foods, because some nights you get to setting up camp and everything, and you just don't have the energy to actually prepare a full meal. Easier to just start the stove, boil a cup of water, pour it in a pouch, eat that thing and pass out. So I was concerned about having perhaps some problems sleeping, being concerned about bears coming around and things like that. If a bear would have come around, he could have eaten me, and I probably wouldn't have waken up. I was just, by the end of the day, I'm out. I was dead to the world. So to your question, John, there will be a link for the presentation because we have recorded it. At least I hope it stayed recording this entire time. That was the plan. So we'll get that link over to you. There's also a lot of people in the field hunting right now. We're right in the middle of deer and elk season in New Mexico and other states. And so I know I've gotten some phone calls from a bunch of people asking if we record it because they would really like to watch it. But right now they don't have access to the internet. Gabe Vasquez, good to hear from you, buddy. Awesome to be back, and thank you for all your support and everything over the years. Christine Gonzalez, surprised that she's on here because she's almost never not in the wilderness. So thank you for taking time out of the outdoors, Christine, to join us this evening. That was awesome. Ray Trejo, he just wants to find the deep snow. That's all he's interested in. My cousin Jackie, love you too, Jackie. Thanks for joining tonight. Any other questions, guys? I know we're way over time at 7:45. I think I told you it would be done at 7:30, and I apologize for being so long-winded. Nothing else from anybody? All right, guys. Well, hey, thank you very much for joining. I'm going to get to work on that video. I'm really, really excited to share that film with everybody because I think it's going to come out great. I've got some phenomenal footage. Dr. Malcolm, look at that. What a beautiful boy, man. Good to see you. Miss your smiling face in New Mexico. Hope everything is going great in Wisconsin, man. All right, everybody. Well, thank you so much again for spending your evening with us here at the Wildlife Federation. Appreciate everybody's support, and I hope everybody has a fantastic hunting season this fall. Please be safe out there. Make sure we leave our public lands better than we left them. You know, still a lot of opportunity for the public to get better about picking up after themselves. So we've got to do our part and pick up after other people and those kinds of things. And also, just a reminder, send me an email or text message if you want to join us on Friday for mapping out this Land and Water Conservation Fund project up in the Hemis around Hemis Springs. Shoot me a message if you want to join us on that trip. It should be a ton of fun. And GPSs and stuff are going to be provided, so you don't really have to bring anything. Show up with appropriate clothing, good hiking boots, a camera, and everything else will be taken care of from there. All right. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a wonderful night.
Thanks, Jesse.
That was awesome job, Jesse Deubel. Great stuff, man.
Thanks, guys.
Welcome home.
Appreciate
Good job,
that.
man. Glad you're back.